HP Lion Tamer PT3. What's going on? Hermione asked the next morning when Harry met her in the common room. Ron just ran out of here like his head was on fire. What happened to your face? Harry had a large purple bruise on his left cheek where Ron had hit him the night before, which still ached a bit. Ron hit me, Harry said glumly. What? Hermione looked utterly dumbfounded. I may have deserved it, Harry admitted, though even he wasn't convinced of it. I compared him to Malfoy. Why in the world would you do that? Hermione asked hotly. Hey! Harry shouted her down. If he hadn't been going on and on about how Daphne imperioused me, maybe I wouldn't have said it. Oh! Hermione said, shaking her head. Oh no, this is getting out of hand. I agree. Harry, why are you talking to her? Hermione asked curiously. Oh, not you too. Harry groaned, heading out of the portrait hole. Not me too what? Hermione followed him. You're going to tell me to drop it? To ignore her because she's evil or wants to turn me over to Voldemort, right? I was going to do no such thing, and I'm a little offended you would even think that of me. Hermione huffed. Harry stopped and turned to look at her apologetically. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have assumed. I was only curious how you two began speaking. I think it's good that you're trying to make friends with her. Frankly, I've always been a bit curious why you never tried to make friends with more people. Harry shrugged and the two of them continued on to the Great Hall. My cousin always used to scare anyone off who tried to be my friend. I guess part of me still thinks that could happen, even though Dudley is terrified of wizards and witches. Maybe it's just because I've been, you know, trained to react to the threat or something. Hermione didn't say anything, but she looked rather upset at Harry's admission. They entered the Great Hall and took seats along the Gryffindor table. Hermione noticed Ron and Seamus sitting with Dean, all of them talking and looking at Harry angrily. What's that about? Hermione asked. Before Ron hit me, I had a row with Seamus. His mother wanted to keep him out of school because of the Daily Prophet. Harry shrugged. Oh. I see. I guess we should have expected that. By the way, what exactly did you say to Lavender and Parvati? When I got to the dorm last night they kept asking me questions about you. They said you had spoken to them earlier, but wouldn't tell me what happened. I apologized to Parvati for being a git at the Yule Ball. Lavender suggested I make it up by taking Parvati to Hogsmeade. Are you going to? Hermione looked surprised by this news. Harry merely shrugged. Let's say I'm trying to keep my options open. I would like to have a normal year, if at all possible, and Sirius suggested I try to be more social. He thinks maybe that will help keep me out of trouble. Or get you into some. Hermione smirked. Hermione, have you thought about dating anyone? Harry inquired. Hermione's eyes bulged out, and she began looking all around them as if this was the setup to some sort of prank. Harry still had his head down to his plate, so he had missed her reaction. Harry. I like you. You're my best friend. Huh? Harry looked up, confused by her words. It's just that well, I don't think I have feelings like that for you. Hermione said, trying to let Harry down easy. What? No. No, Hermione, you're like my sister. That's not what I was asking. Harry said, his face going just as red as Hermione's. They both began to chuckle, which turned into a full-blown hysterical laughing fit. I'm sorry, it's just the way that you phrased that. Hermione wiped the tears from her eyes, her face still rather pink from her earlier embarrassment. I guess I didn't think that question through. It's just that we're all in that age where we think about that sort of thing, and I was just wondering how it might affect our friendships. We've been pretty close, and like I said, I think of you as a sister, and I want the best for you. That's really sweet, Harry. Thank you. Harry simply shrugged, while Hermione thought about his question. I suppose I have thought about it. After the ball last year, I guess it was kind of hard not to think about it all. I am nearly 16 after all. I'll admit that there are a few guys that I might find interesting. Is Ron one of them? Harry asked, peering down the table at his other friend. I don't know. She shrugged, her voice unable to hide her disappointment in their red-headed friend who was busy stuffing his face further along the table. He's got a few good qualities, but he's also got a lot of not-so-good qualities. I just don't think Ron and I would be a good match. I mean, look at how much we argue. Do you think you'd be friends with him if it wasn't for me? Hermione's face fell and she shook her head slowly. If it weren't for you, I would have been done in by that troll. Ron was the reason I was even in that bathroom, if you recall. Harry nodded. Things are strained between us, and I'm worried that we won't be able to fix them. Harry, Ron cares for you like any of his other brothers, and brothers fight. He's afraid of losing you to other people. You know how he compares himself to his other brothers. You're the thing that sets him apart from them. At this, Harry frowned. It makes me wonder if he's ever been my friend because of who I am, rather than my fame. I think so. Otherwise, he'd not be putting up so much resistance to the idea of you making friends with Slytherins. Did I hear you correctly, Miss Granger? Professor McGonagall stood behind Harry, class schedules in her hand. Are you trying to make friends with Slytherins? Mostly Harry is, ma'am. Hermione smiled at her favorite teacher. Well done, Mr. Potter. 5 points for school pride. The usually stern teacher gave the smallest of smiles and handed them their schedules. Wow! Hermione mouthed, watching their transfiguration teacher bustle off to finish handing out schedules. You made her smile. I did. Harry asked, as his back had been to McGonagall the whole time. Can you imagine what things could be like if our house and theirs could forget this stupid feud? I don't know. It might take the fun out of Quidditch. Harry grinned. Hermione reached across the table to swat his arm. You prat. She smiled. Come on, let's get to history. I might need you to prod me to stay awake. Daphne and Tracy did not fail to notice the disparaging looks they were getting from the housemates, or the fact that they were being sort of isolated. When they sat down for breakfast, several people close to them stood up and left, and no one else would sit close to them if they could help it. The girls simply shook their heads and ignored it all. They were joined finally by Daphne's younger sister, Astoria, who looked rather proud. Please tell me it's true. She smiled. Astoria was quite similar to her sister in looks, though her hair was much lighter in color, and she looked a bit more like their father, especially her nose. Tell me you really are going out with Harry Potter. Tracy nearly shot milk out her nose at this statement, while Daphne dropped her fork loudly. Astoria was practically bouncing in her seat waiting for her sister to answer her. Daphne looked at Tracy for help, but her blonde friend was too busy cleaning her face, or rather hiding behind her napkin to offer any help. I'm not going out with Harry. Daphne sighed, retrieving her fork from the floor. Yet. Tracy added. Daphne glared at her friend. I've only just started talking to him. He's nice, and I'm hoping to become his friend. And then his girlfriend? Astoria asked hopefully. Why are you so interested in my love life? Daphne questioned. Well, I'm a little concerned with what's going to happen to you because of all this mess. But also, I'm really proud of you. I think most other people would just go along with Malfoy just to avoid trouble. But if you're going to shake things up because of how stupid house rivalries are, why not do it with gusto and snare the Gryffindor golden boy? Besides, Harry's really cute. Daphne smiled at her sister. Astoria had apparently started coming to the same conclusions she herself had come to a few years before. She hoped that Astoria might follow her example, and widen her circle of friends outside of the Slytherin dorms. Are you going to marry him? This time, Tracy's milk did come out her nose, and she nearly fell on the floor laughing. Astoria, having seen the amazing milk nose trick, began laughing hysterically, while Daphne could only stare in utter bemusement at her younger sister. She couldn't believe what had just left her barely 12-year-old sister's mouth. If Daphne were honest with herself, she would have been able to admit that she had once or twice fantasized about a life with Harry Potter. She had managed to repress it all in order to focus on building her relationship with the boy. However, it was questions like that which made it increasingly difficult not to follow Tracy's advice, and her own desire, and grab Harry and kiss him. Tracy managed to haul herself back up on her seat, and shoved her goblet away. Perhaps it was best to refrain from drinking anything further until little Astoria went away. Astoria had also managed to get herself under control and was looking at her sister with hopeful eyes. Could you introduce me to him? Careful, Daphne. Tracy could not stop grinning. Your little sister might be trying to steal your potential boyfriend. Daphne whipped her head up sharply and cracked it in the process, which made Tracy guffaw, and Astoria to look up worriedly. Look, why don't you let me actually build some kind of friendship with him, and then I'll introduce you? Daphne said, not really sure what was happening. Astoria smiled and hopped up out of her seat and headed up the table where her second-year friends were waiting. What the hell just happened? Daphne asked Tracy, who had her head buried in her arms. Daphne could hear snorts of laughter, and smacked Tracy's head. Stop it. I'm sorry, but your sister has big plans for you. She's already got you and Harry married, and you seem to be trying to keep things at a slow pace. Well, I don't want to scare the boy. Daphne looked tensely at the Gryffindor table. We've only just started talking, and for the most part all we talked about is prejudices and stupid house rivalries. I don't know a thing about him, and he doesn't know anything about me. Then teach him a few things about you, like how you feel in a broom cupboard. Tracy suggested. Daphne gave her a wry look, and shook her head. I think you need to get your mind out of the gutter. Good morning, ladies. Professor Snape said flatly as he handed them their schedules. He stared at Daphne for a moment before he continued on his way. That was a bit strange. Daphne said. What? Professor Snape just stared at me, like he was trying to I don't know. It was just weird. Tracy grimaced, looking at her schedule. Herbology first thing. It's still raining out. We'd better get moving. The greenhouses are all the way on the other side of the school. Harry had managed to stay awake through History of Magic, thanks in large part to Hermione actually poking him in the ribs. He would have been upset, except that he had asked her to do it, as she reminded him when they left class. Ron had not sat next to them, as he was obviously still angry at Harry. Harry wished that he and Ron could settle things between them, but Ron seemed to want to have nothing to do with Harry for the moment. Don't worry, he'll come around, Hermione said as they started making their way to the dungeons for double potions. Harry and Hermione were discussing what their first lesson was likely to be, when Harry, not paying attention to where he was going, ran right into Cho Chang. "Oh, I'm sorry," Harry said, stooping to help her gather her books. "I guess I should have checked to see where you were going." Cho laughed, and Harry felt his palms get a bit sweaty. "Have a good summer, Harry." Harry shrugged. "All right, I guess." "That's good, I suppose. Well, I have to get to runes." "I'll see you later then." "Yeah." Harry gave a weak smile and watched her go. "Come on, lover boy." Hermione laughed, taking Harry's arm and guiding him to the dungeons. They were the last to arrive to the hall outside of class, where the rest of the Gryffindors and the Slytherins were waiting to be allowed into the potions lab. "Hi Harry," Daphne said, coming up to the raven-haired boy, who still looked a little goofy. "Forgive him." Hermione rolled her eyes. "He got hit with a hormone hex." "A what?" Harry asked. Hermione's comment had knocked the cobwebs from his head, and he smiled to Daphne. "How's you day been so far?" "All right." "Had herbology already?" "After lunch it's runes." Daphne smiled. "Oh, me too." Hermione brightened a bit. "You should sit with us," Tracy said. She was standing just behind Daphne. "I think I'd like that," Hermione said. At that moment the door to the potions class, and Snape waved them in. Harry noticed a lack of curled lip, or superior sneer, as he walked next to Daphne into the class. He and Hermione took a table right next to Daphne and Tracy. The door closed with a heavy thud, and Harry watched Snape cross to the front of the class. The greasy-haired professor faced his class, folding his long arms into his cloak. "Before we begin, I'd like to mention that at the end of this year, you will be sitting a very important examination. This test will prove exactly how much you have learned regarding the composition and uses of potions. Imbecilic as many of you appear to be, I expect you all to manage at least acceptable in your owl, or I shall be more than a little put out." There was a collective shiver throughout the class, which Snape ignored. His black eyes had settled on Neville, who Harry thought might be trembling a bit. "After this year ends, many of you will no longer be taking my class, as I will only accept students into minute classes who have received outstanding. This time, Snape's eyes found Harry, who stared back defiantly. "However, we still have an entire year to get through before that happy moment, and I think we should begin. We will start the year off with a concoction that will most assuredly come up in your examination in some form. The Draft of Peace. Please read the instructions through very carefully, as this is quite a temperamental potion. Ingredients, on the board. You may begin." At once the student began gathering ingredients to brew the potion. Harry decided that he wanted to do his best, or at least come up with something Snape could not criticize. As he performed each line of instruction, he would read it several times through to make sure he was doing it correctly. He fought every urge to look around the class, and focus hard on his own work. Snape announced that class was coming to a close by telling them all there should be a silver vapor coming from their potions. Harry couldn't tell if the steam coming from his cauldron was exactly silvery, but it was at least light in color, which made him feel pleased. Hermione, of course, had managed to brew a perfect draft. She ladled a bit into a crystal vial and labeled it with her name. "Time is up," Snape said. Harry corked a vial and took a quick look around the room. Ron's potion was issuing a rather thick greenish smoke, while it looked like Seamus was chipping something that resembled concrete of his cauldron to put in a vial. Both Daphne and Tracy had perfect-looking potions, while Malfoy's looked rather muddy. Harry handed his vial to Snape, who looked at it for several moments. Harry waited for the remarks, but none came. Instead, Snape looked up at him with a questioning expression. "Can I help you, Potter?" Snape asked more than a little irritably. No sir," Harry stuttered. "Just handing in my potion, which I have received. Now as there is precious little time left, I suggest you clean up your workstation before you leave, or I shall give you detention, and you can clean all the potions labs." Harry nodded and went to gather his things. Hermione stared at him while he cleaned his things, but managed to hold her tongue until they were out of class. "That was amazing. He didn't say anything horrible to you." "Well done, Harry," Daphne said as she sidled up next to him. "You had Malfoy distracted all class. He's usually a fair hand at potions, but he seemed flummoxed today." "Don't get too excited," Harry cautioned. "I'm sure I'll screw up next time, and Snape will get to insult my intelligence and my upbringing, and then give me detentions." Harry and the three girls headed to the Great Hall for lunch, where they separated, heading for their respective tables. Harry and Hermione sat down next to Fred and George, who looked nearly giddy. "So, Harry." George grinned as Harry sat down next to him. "There's a rather sinister rumor going around that you were seen with a couple of Slytherin girls. Should we be worried that you're falling to the temptation of the dark side?" Fred looked concerned, though Harry saw the twinkle of mischief in his eyes. "Yes, I did have a very nice conversation with Daphne Greengrass and Tracy Davis," Harry said firmly. "They're very nice." "Oi! You actually spoke to the Ice Queen?" Fred asked, flabbergasted. George also looked more than a little impressed. "Who?" Hermione asked, looking between the twins. "Daphne Greengrass, of course," Fred said. "They call her the Ice Queen, because she's so cold to everyone." "That's not the impression I got from her at all," Hermione said, casting her eyes over her shoulder to the Slytherin table. "She's been very friendly to us. She is easily one of the prettiest girls in the school, no question. But she's always so aloof when boys have tried to talk to her," George said. "How'd you break through her frosty defenses?" "Actually, she sought me out," Harry admitted. "At the end of last year. We talked a bit and agreed that we would try and get to know each other this year." "Harry, when exactly did this happen?" Hermione asked, looking a bit worried. "While I was still in the hospital wing." "Why?" Hermione began chewing her bottom lip, but shook her head. "Just curious." "Hermione, I know that look. What's on your mind?" Harry pressed. "Well, it's likely just a coincidence, but it's a bit dodgy that a Slytherin would suddenly want to strike up a friendship with you right after you know who returns." "That is rather suspect, Harry," Fred agreed. "It would be if she hadn't admitted to wanting to talk to me before, but being afraid of what her housemates would do," Harry responded. "Look, guys, I know I don't always have the best judgment, but she's all right." "Harry, we're not saying she's not," George said, placing a hand on Harry's shoulder. "We just don't want to see you hurt. If you like her, forget everything else, and be her friend." "I wish Ron felt the same," Harry said, peering down the table to where Ron sat with Dean and Seamus. "Ron's pretty stubborn, you know that. Once he sees that she's not dangerous, he'll come around." "Excuse me." They all turned to see a young girl with light brown hair standing there, clutching a few books to her chest. The crest on her robes told them she was a Slytherin. "How can we help you?" Fred asked, a bit crossly. The girl's eyes went to Fred's, quivering a bit before returning to look at Harry. "My name is Astoria, and I was just wondering what your intentions toward my sister are." Harry looked taken aback at the question, but before he could say anything, Hermione spoke up. "Who's your sister?" Hermione asked, a small smile starting to appear on her face, as she already suspected the answer. "Daphne Greengrass," Astoria said. "Did she send you over here?" Hermione asked. "No. In fact, I doubt she even knows I'm talking to you. She really likes you. She stood up to Malfoy defending you last night." "She would?" Harry asked, now turning to look over at the Slytherin table. "Malfoy had most of the house waiting for her when she got to the common room last night, and accused her of betraying the house by talking to you. So are you two going to go out?" Hermione began smirking, while Fred and George guffawed at the girl's forthrightness. Harry could only stammer and stare bewilderingly at the girl, who looked to be growing impatient. Thankfully Hermione came to his aid. "It's far too early for either of them to say one way or the other. They've only just begun talking to each other." Astoria sighed heavily, and shook her head. "That's what Daphne said." "I'm sorry," Harry said, hoping to placate the girl somehow. "I don't see why you can't get to know each other while being together," Astoria said hotly, and stormed away. Harry watched her go, utterly confused at what had just happened. When he turned back to Hermione, Fred, and George, there was a moment of awkward silence before the three of them burst out laughing at Harry. "I'm going to kill her," Daphne said, her head banging against the desk in front of her. "I'm going to squeeze the life out of her. Oh sure, Mum and Dad might be upset, but once I explain why I had to do it, they'll be fine. They're still young. They could still make a new one. Maybe one who wasn't so nosy, or determined to meddle in your love life," Tracy asked helpfully. "Yeah, or that." Hermione could not stop smirking, nor could Tracy for that matter. Hermione had told them all about Astoria's visit with her and Harry at lunch. Daphne's color had faded until she was nearly as white as any of the Hogwarts ghosts. "So how long have you fancied Harry?" Hermione asked. Daphne, her head still on her desk, could only shrug. "I started sometime during third year, I suppose." She used to stare at him from across the Great Hall like a lost puppy. Tracy added. "Why didn't you ever try to talk to him? Or any of us before now?" Daphne finally lifted her head, some of her color returning. "Fear mostly. Fear of rejection, fear of the fallout. Just fear." "I guess I understand that," Hermione said. "The thing is, after the final task, I was more afraid of never getting the chance," Daphne admitted. "I mean, he does get himself into a lot of rather dangerous situations, doesn't he?" Hermione made a non-committal noise, not knowing if she should share anything with Daphne and Tracy. She wasn't sure if she would be betraying Harry's trust, and felt it best to keep quiet. "So, when I saw all of you in the Great Hall, I figured it was my best chance to try." He was kind of cold at first, angry and incredibly sad. "But he didn't tell me to shove off. We only talked a few minutes, and he said we could spend some time together this year. So all summer I thought about how I could talk to him, and build a friendship. Which could become something more," Hermione pressed. Again Daphne's face flushed and she lowered her head back to the desk. "I think that means yes." Tracy giggled lightly. "Yes, okay. Yes," Daphne said, her head shooting up. "I like him. I think he's incredibly gorgeous, and he's polite and sweet and gracious. But the truth is, I don't know him and he doesn't know me. What if it turns out we hate each other?" Hermione actually smiled at this. I think it's a really good idea to spend time getting to know him, before trying to date. But just so you know, Harry's somewhat guarded, it won't be easy to get to know him. You'll have to be very patient with him. Daphne nodded, and before she could ask anything else, Professor Babbling began the class with a long-winded speech about their coming owls. He then began his first lesson, which gave the girls no more time to speak. When class finished, they all gathered their things together and began heading out to their next class. Hermione, Daphne said, taking hold of the bushy-haired witch's arm. I just want to thank you for your advice about Harry. It means a lot to me that you're willing to allow me to get to know him. Harry is smart enough to make his own decisions, and I would never presume to tell him how to live his life, though he might think otherwise. I do nag him a bit about finishing his schoolwork. Just don't hurt him. I think he's had enough of that in his life. Hermione smiled a bit sadly and then headed off for defense against the dark arts, leaving her two new friends to wonder exactly what she had meant. Harry was trying desperately to keep his anger in check at the moment. He was far too upset to even attempt to eat dinner, even thought he was quite hungry, and the food on his plate smelled incredible. All around him, Hogwarts students were whispering rather loudly about the scene that had taken place mere hours before in the new defense teacher's classroom. Harry had lost his temper at the new little teacher, and a shouting match had taken place, ending when Professor Umbridge had made Harry leave the classroom. The juiciest bit of gossip was the revelation that Harry had let slip that he had fought against the resurrected Lord Voldemort. Professor Umbridge had tried to assure her class that Harry's claims were nothing more than lies to frighten them all. Harry had no idea what was said after he left, but it seemed to Harry that Professor Umbridge had won this particular battle. Harry could hear people around him voicing their opinion about his claims, and it only served to irritate him further. How can they all sit there all but calling me a liar when 2 months ago they believed it all? Harry asked, keeping his eyes on his plate. Not daring to look up for fear he might lash out when he saw someone talking about him. Harry, Neville said. The round-faced boy had sat with Harry and Hermione, and they'd been joined by Ginny, who was hoping to hear about what had happened firsthand. I'm not sure they did. Dumbledore told us what had happened, but we only had his word on it. Though we spent the summer being told through the paper and the wireless what a nutter you were and how Dumbledore's going senile. If we had had a little more time before we went home for the summer, or we could have seen what happened in the maze. Neville let his words hang, and Harry sighed heavily. Once again he peered down the table to where Ron was sitting. He no longer looked angry, but morose. He turned to look at Harry, but looked away quickly when he caught Harry's eye. I still can't believe Professor McGonagall wouldn't at least change your detention. I mean, you could have served it with her. Hermione said sadly. She says that as a teacher, Umbridge has the right to give me detentions. Harry shrugged. Can we get out of here? Hermione, Neville, and Ginny rose together, and headed back up to the Gryffindor Tower. Why did you let her get to you like that? Ginny asked. I don't know. Harry growled. I just hated her talking about how safe we were when Voldemort's out there now, waiting to kill us all. I couldn't take it. You're going to have to try and control your temper, Harry. Hermione said. That's what McGonagall said. Harry sighed. I've got a little time before I have to go see the Toad, let's work on the essay for Snape. Neville started to walk away when Harry stopped him. Where are you going, Nev? I didn't think you'd want me to study with you. I just... Neville said, looking rather nervous. Nonsense, Neville, you're more than welcome to work with us. Hermione said, patting the couch cushion next to herself. Harry noticed Neville's face burn red, and saw Ginny watching the boy carefully as he sat next to Hermione. The youngest Weasley child seemed to be puzzling over something, her brow furrowed in concentration. "When did you start fancying Hermione?" Ginny asked out loud, and then as she realized what she had just said quickly covered her mouth with both her hands, looking very mortified and repentant. Neville's eyes shot up, looking humiliated by Ginny's question, while Hermione looked between Neville and Ginny with a very puzzled look. Harry had figured out Neville might fancy his best friend the day before on the train, but had wisely decided it best for them to work things out on their own. It looked as though fate, and Ginny had other ideas. "Neville?" Hermione asked softly, her eyes questioning, but Neville got up and disappeared into the boys' dormitory. Both Harry and Hermione looked to Ginny, who was redder than either could remember her ever looking before. Harry was able to hide his smile as he thought to himself, "That's a new shade of Weasley red. I didn't mean to say it out loud, I swear it," Ginny said, though it was somewhat muffled, as she had yet to remove her hands from covering her mouth. "I just saw him looking at you so sweetly, and it just happened." "Neville fancies me?" Hermione looked completely taken by surprise. "I don't know what to say." "There's not really anything to say," Harry said. "You need to figure out how you feel about him and then let him know." "He's a good guy, Hermione." "I know that," Hermione said rather irately. "I just don't know if I feel anything for him. To be honest, I don't know that we've ever had any conversation that lasts longer than a minute or two." "He's a very sweet guy, you know," Ginny said, trying to be helpful. "You could do a lot worse than him. I know he's not the best looking guy in the school, but—" "I don't care about looks," Hermione said indignantly. This is rather overwhelming. I need to think about this." With that, Hermione gathered her things and went to her dorm, leaving Harry and Ginny alone. Ginny looked to Harry, remorse on her face. "I didn't mean to embarrass him. I just pulled a Ron." Harry smiled lightly. "I guess. Speaking of which, what's going on between you two anyway?" "He's been giving you the evil eye all day. He's angry that I'm making friends with Daphne Greengrass and Tracy Davis." Harry shrugged. "He's sure that they're evil and they're going to kill me, or hand me over to Voldemort." "You're talking to the Ice Queen." Ginny's face was unreadable, though Harry thought he saw something like suspicion in her eyes. "Yeah, I am. She's nice. I don't know why everyone is so concerned about this. It's not a big deal. She's a decent person, and I've enjoyed talking to her. Maybe it's because she's a Slytherin, and they usually end up being incredible gits." "No one wants to see you get hurt, Harry." Ginny sighed. Harry shook his head. "Thanks, but I can take care of myself, and so long as she continues to be nice, I'll keep hanging out with her. It's no one's business anyway." "I just think you can do better, Harry," Ginny remarked offhandedly. Her face suddenly began to color red again, and just like Hermione and Neville before her, Ginny ran off to the dormitories. Harry rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to relieve a bit of tension. "Why is this such an issue?" Harry wondered. "There's nothing wrong with making new friends. It shouldn't matter what house they're in." Harry decided he should head down to Umbridge's office for his detention, as it looked like he wasn't going to get any homework done now. "Hi," Astoria said with a rather precocious smile as she sat across from her sister. Daphne saw Tracy pushing her goblet away from her, undoubtedly so she wouldn't try and take a drink while her sister was present. There were far more people present at dinner than there was at breakfast, and Tracy likely did not wish to repeat her new milk nose trick. "Hello, Dearest sister. How was your day? Daphne smiled a falsely sweet smile. She wanted to lay into her younger sister for sticking her cute button nose into other people's affairs, especially since that other person happened to be her. Talk to anyone interesting today? Astoria clearly didn't notice her older sister's growing irritation, or was ignoring it altogether. Yes, I talked to Harry Potter today. She smiled as she reached onto her elder sister's plate, taking her dinner roll, and tearing it to tiny little pieces. I decided that I couldn't wait for you to introduce me, and figured if you could do it, so could I. Anyway, I just heard something very disheartening. I heard that he got in trouble in defense today. He called Professor Umbridge a liar. What? Daphne and Tracy said in unison. Abigail Flint heard some Hufflepuff saying that Harry had shouted at Professor Umbridge and claimed that he fought you-know-who last year. She gave him detention, but he wouldn't stop yelling at her, and she made him leave class. He's going to get in serious trouble if he doesn't learn to keep his mouth shut and his head down, Tracy remarked. Daphne nodded her agreement. What if she provoked him? What if she's setting him up for something? Daphne asked. Like what? Astoria asked. Don't you have somewhere else to be? Daphne asked exasperated. Astoria smiled and shook her head. I don't have any homework or anything. Go away. Daphne shouted. Astoria's smile fell and she glared at her sister, tossing what was left of the mangled roll back onto Daphne's plate. I'm just trying to help you and your boyfriend. Erg. Daphne shrieked, clutching fistfuls of her shiny dark hair. Astoria stuck her tongue out and skipped away to where a few of her friends were sitting, watching their interaction curiously. Do you think that she's trying to pin Cedric's murder on Harry? Like she's trying to get him to admit it or something? Tracy asked. Seeing Harry and a few of his fellow Gryffindors getting up from their table and leaving the hall. It would make sense. Daphne said thoughtfully. If they could pin that on Harry, then it would be clear that Harry and Dumbledore's stories were obviously made up. What do you think she'll make him do for detention? Tracy asked, a hint of true concern in her voice. I don't know. Daphne stared at the door to the Great Hall thoughtfully. It was clear to her that Minister Fudge had some sort of agenda now, though it was very unclear what it might be. She wondered if they were planning on charging Harry with Cedric's murder, why they wouldn't just take him into custody and put him on trial. But then she realized that if Harry asked to take Veritaserum, which he would likely be advised to do, the administration would not only have to make reparations to Harry for falsely accusing him, but also for slandering his name in the paper. On top of that, the world would know he'd been telling the truth, and Daphne doubted anyone was prepared to face the fact that the greatest dark wizard of all time had returned from the dead. Daphne was afraid for Harry once again. This time she doubted he would be able to face this particular storm on his own. Come on, let's get to work on that essay for Professor Snape. If we go now, we might be able to get hold of some books before Granger confiscates them all for her essay. Daphne said, rising from her seat. As they began heading towards the library, neither of them noticed a cold stare from Draco Malfoy, who was still fuming over his embarrassment the night before. He sat with his fellow fifth years, the ones who trusted him, and knew what Howe's loyalty meant. What are we going to do about them? Pansy asked. They're going to infect the entire house with their poison. We're going to help them remember who their true friends are. Draco smiled a devious smile as he turned his attention back to his associates. But we have to do this very delicately, or Bumbledore might try and interfere. What do you have in mind? Theodore Nott, a thin boy with a very aristocratic demeanor asked, his eyes alight with mischief. Draco sometimes wondered why the Knots and the Malfoys were not closer. If Theo was any indication, the two families share many common interests and goals. Draco thought some sort of alliance would have been beneficial, but the one time he'd brought it up to his father, Lucius had scoffed. The Knots are little better than squibs, he had said before ordering Draco to remove himself from his father's study. Draco couldn't understand his father's outlook, as Theodore seemed to be quite powerful. He was typically one of the first to master new spells, and he was well read in some of the more exquisite dark spells. Draco's only conclusion could be that Mr. Knott and his father had some sort of disagreement or something. We'll have to start slowly, I'd rather not cause permanent damage if I can help it. We have to show them that Potter and his friends aren't the saints that people think they are, Draco sneered. But Draco, Millicent said nervously. No one thinks Potter's a saint. In fact, most everyone thinks he's a fame-seeking brat, who's trying to keep his name in the papers. Yeah, for now. How long do you think it will be before Potter goes and does something all noble and brave and everyone forgets what a fame whore he is? Draco spat. We know what a phony he is, and it's our duty as proper wizards to show the rest of this lot the truth. Everyone nodded their agreement, except Millicent, who looked rather skeptical of Draco's intentions. The truth was, she didn't believe Draco's philosophy, and was becoming increasingly disenchanted with Slytherin House as a whole. She had spoken to one of the French girls from Beaux Batons last year, and had learned that there were no houses, or sorting, and that people were free to associate with whomever they wished. Millie often looked around at her fellow classmates, and students from other years, and envied them their friendships. In first year, she had begun making friends with Mandy Brocklehurst, from Ravenclaw. However, Pansy, and a couple of older girls had come to her rescue and saved her from making a grave mistake. Since then, Millie had been Pansy's shadow, almost forced to go everywhere she did. All they ever talked about was Pansy, and whatever she was interested in. Anytime Millie tried to talk about something she liked, Pansy always twisted the conversation back, so she was once again the focus. Millie had rarely spoken to Daphne or Tracy, mostly due to Pansy. But their words from the night before were still echoing in her head. She deserved a real friend or two. Maybe, Millie thought to herself. It's time I got one or two. Good evening, Mr. Potter. Dolores Umbridge smiled sweetly, her wide toad-like mouth smiling. Good evening, Professor Umbridge. Harry said rather stiffly. He had thought on the way down to her office it might be a good idea to try and be civilized with her. So far, he felt he was off to a decent start. Please, sit down. You will be writing lines for me this evening. Oh, no, no. She said as Harry reached into his bag for a quill. You will be using a very special quill of mine. She stood from her seat and crossed to where Harry had sat down, handing him a thin black quill. Harry noticed the tip looked sharper than any quill he'd ever seen, but shrugged it off. He turned to Umbridge expectantly, but she simply smiled. Off you go then. But you haven't given me any ink. Should I use my own? He asked, trying to sound as polite as possible. Oh, you will not require any ink. You will write, I must not tell lies. How many times? Until the message sinks in, I think. Now, if you please. Harry bent his head, and placed the tip of the black quill to parchment and began to scratch out the words he'd been ordered to write, when he began feeling a itch on the back of his pen hand. The quill seemed to be self-inking, because there on the parchment, in dark red ink, were the words he was supposed to write. I must not tell lies. Harry wrote 2 more lines, each time the itching on the back of his hand feeling more annoying, until on the 4th line, he felt a sting. Harry stopped writing to look at his hand and was sickened to see, in his own handwriting, the very words he had been writing on the parchment. Harry peered closer to the ink, and a sudden realization hit him. The ink was blood. His blood. Harry stared at the quill and then to Umbridge, who waited behind her desk, that hideous sweet smile on her face. "What is this?" Harry asked angrily, looking horror-struck at the new defense teacher. "Is there a problem?" Umbridge asked sweetly. "Yes, there's a problem." "What is this thing?" "It can't be legal." "I assure you that it is perfectly acceptable," Umbridge said firmly. "Really? Well, then you won't mind if I ask Professor McGonagall then, will you?" Harry stood up from his seat and began heading for the door. He was just reaching out for the knob when his body suddenly stiffened as if frozen. His arms and legs snapped together, and he fell to the floor with a heavy thud. A moment later, he felt himself being rolled over, and Professor Umbridge was standing over him, a cold, cruel smile on her pouchy face. "Let's get one thing clear this instant, Mr. Potter. I will not tolerate misbehavior from anyone. I am not here because Professor Dumbledore has asked me to be here. I am here because the Minister of Magic wishes it. As such, I have the entire ministry behind me. So, should you wish to try and spread your vicious little lies about me to one of the other teacher in the vain hope to be rid of me, do try and remember that it will be my word the ministry listens to. Now, if you would like, you can serve the rest of your detention here with me, or I can send a letter to Minister Fudge, and see to your removal from Hogwarts." Harry wanted nothing more than to reach out and clutch the arrogant toad's throat and squeeze until her eyes bulged out of her fat head. But he knew in that moment he was going to have to fall in line for now. Umbridge let him out of the body bind, and Harry grudgingly went back to his seat and continued his punishment, gritting his teeth the entire time. Occasionally he would look up to see Umbridge watching him as if he were a particularly juicy fly she couldn't wait to catch and devour. Harry simply kept working, concentrating hard on not making any noise of discomfort. For 3.5 hours, Harry scratched away at his parchment, and through that, his hand. With each and every letter, his hatred for the woman was etched deeper into him. At last, Professor Umbridge rose from her desk and took his hand in hers to examine the damage. "Ah, I see that you are starting to get the message. Tomorrow evening, same time. You are free to go." Umbridge smiled. "Good night, Mr. Potter." Harry just glared at the squat teacher before leaving her office. Harry thought about going to see McGonagall, but Umbridge's threat still rang in his ear. Could she really have him removed from Hogwarts? And what would happen to him if she managed it? Would he go back to the Dursleys, or would he be able to stay with Sirius? These questions rattled around in his head as he made his way upstairs to the dormitories. He entered through the portrait hole and found Hermione sitting in front of the fire. She looked up and gave a weak smile as he sat down next to him. "How was your detention?" she asked softly. "It was." Harry wanted to tell her everything, but he could hear Umbridge's threats echoing in his head. "Fine. No big deal." "What did she have you do?" Hermione asked, turning back to her book. "Lines," Harry said, his hand stinging from the scratches he'd spent the evening cutting into himself. "That's not so bad," Hermione said, her tone warming. "Nah," Harry agreed. "Harry, I wanted to tell you earlier, but, well, with everything that happened today, I never really got the chance." "What?" Harry looked up. Hermione turned to look at him and smiled. "That little girl at lunch, Daphne's sister. She was telling the truth. Daphne does fancy you. I asked her about it in runes today, and she really likes you." Harry sat up a bit, his face looking confused. The thing is, she wants to really get to know you. She wants to try and build a real relationship with you. Okay. Harry said, not really understanding what Hermione was saying here. I think you should give her a chance. Hermione said. There aren't many girls who are going to be interested in the real Harry, but I think Daphne is one of them. I know that you like Cho, and everything, but, well, think about it, okay? Sure. Harry smiled, remembering how Sirius had said virtually the same thing just before school. What about you? I think she's nice, but I don't really fancy girls. Hermione quipped. You know what I mean. Harry smiled, poking Hermione in the side. She let out a small scream and hit him in the arm with her book. Harry wrestled the book away from her and managed to fend her off until she calmed down. So, how about it? Now you know of a boy who apparently likes you. Harry commented. I know, and Neville's a lovely enough person, but I really don't know. Maybe you should spend some time with him, and just see what happens. At the very least, you could have a very good friend in him. I suppose. Hermione sighed. I just hate to string him along or something. Harry nodded and smiled at his friend. You'll do the right thing. Harry said as he got to his feet. For the both of you. The portrait door opened and they both turned to see Ron coming in, holding his broom. Oh, hi, he said, looking a little guilty. Harry started to turn to head up to bed when Ron called out to him. Harry turned back around and watched as Ron came over to them. I shouldn't have hit you. I'm sorry for that. I shouldn't have compared you to Malfoy. Harry said, shoving his hands in his pocket, wincing ever so slightly as the fabric brushed against his stinging cuts. He didn't notice the look of curiosity that passed on Hermione's face. Umbridge wasn't too hard on you, was she? Ron asked. Harry shook his head, a small smile on his face. Ron, you've been my best friend since first year, and I can't imagine life without you in it. But if you don't stop being so damned stubborn and immature, one day you're going to say something that you can't take back, and our friendship will be over. You've got to grow up, or you could end up being left behind, mate. Ron lowered his eyes, and nodded lightly. I'm going to bed, he said, stepping past Harry and trudging up the stairs. Harry watched him go, feeling bad about what he'd said, but knowing it had to be done. Well done, Harry. Hermione said, getting up from the sofa and coming to stand next to him. Then why do I feel like a complete git? He needed to hear that, and it really did need to come from you, or he wouldn't have listened at all. Hermione then surprised him, and clutched his wrist, pulling his hand out of his pocket to examine his hand. Harry pulled it away, but not before Hermione got a good look at it. I thought you said she was making you do lines. Hermione asked, looking truly horrified at the sight of his hand. She is. Harry said, rubbing at his sore hand. She's making me use this weird quill that cuts my hand and writes in my blood. Harry grimaced. Harry, you've got to tell Professor McGonagall. I tried. Harry nearly shouted. I got up from my desk, and was going to take the quill to McGonagall, when she put me in a body-bind curse. She told me that she's got the whole ministry behind her, and she said it would be my word against hers, and that she could have me expelled. Harry said, his hands ruffling his hair in frustration. She's got me, Hermione. I have to play her game, or she'll kick me out of here. Hermione sat down, as her legs weakened, her hand going to her mouth in disgust at what she had just heard. I can do this, Hermione. Harry said bravely. I've been tortured by Voldemort. This. Harry smiled, holding up his hand. This is nothing. If you need any help. Hermione said, wiping at the angry tears stinging her soft brown eyes. I could use some help on my homework tomorrow, if you have the time. You got it? She smiled weakly. Harry gave her one of his patented lopsided grins, and then headed off for bed, leaving her alone in the common room. Hermione was more than angry at Umbridge. Not only was she not going to be teaching them magic, not only was she spying on Dumbledore, and trying to sow dissent within the school, but she was torturing her best friend. Hermione was not going to let that stand if she could help it. She was going to make it her life's ambition to take that toady little woman down. Hermione sighed as she stared into the fire. Harry deserved so much more happiness. He deserved a better life than what he had been given. Hermione wondered if she might be able to help him to find a little bit of happiness, and then she thought of Daphne Greengrass, the very pretty Slytherin who had admitted to fancying her best friend. I shouldn't interfere, Hermione told herself, and yet, her mind was already thinking of ways she might help the girl get closer to her best friend. Please like and subscribe.